Everybody, my name's Richard Dennis. I'm the director of the Australia Institute. If you haven't been to politics in the pub before, welcome. It's a pub. We're going to hear about some politics. We're very lucky to have Cathy, who I'll introduce in a second. But just a couple of announcements first. Do you remember we said we had Anthony Albanese coming? Yeah, he's not. It's just a diary issue. We are going to try and reschedule. So we did announce the date for that. Please scratch that one out, and we'll email you shortly. If you haven't been before, there'll be some clipboards floating around. Just put your email address down. That's really the best way to find out about the upcoming events. They're about once a month, but we wait till we get great speakers and then we tell you about it. So that'll be soon. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Cathy McGowan tonight, the member for Indi. You might have heard of her, and you might have heard about the person that used to have her seat, Sophie Mirabella. But what you might not have heard is that I made a lot of money in the last election. So I bet on this woman. So it's interesting at some point. You know, I'm an economist, and people always think markets get it right. And at one point, the odds said that it was 25 to 1. And I thought, I don't think it's 25 to 1. But I must admit, I dilly-dallied for a little while, and I didn't get a bet on until it was 12 to 1. So I put a couple $100 on, and I did well. And I don't know what the odds got to by election night. Do you know what they got to? Because they just kept coming in the whole time. And the reason I kind of was aware of this, and I think it's really important, is a good friend of mine, I won't name them tonight, but they were really interested in Cathy's campaign from the very outset. And this woman told me about, you know, these kitchen table conversations that were happening in the community, and how a lot of people were out talking to a lot of people about the election and about how they needed change and about how they needed a local member who'd listen to them. And she ran me through both what was happening and who the candidate was, and I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. I'm going to pay a little bit of attention to that. And again, when I saw 25 to 1, I thought, oh, there might be an opportunity in here. So it's my great pleasure to say, not only did the Australian Parliament benefit from electing another great independent. I actually think independents play a really important part in our democracy. I think the two parties have a role, but I think independents bring a different perspective and a different voice. And I think it was, I think a lot of people in this room might think it was quite a sweet victory for a lot of people who didn't get to vote for you, but I'm sure they're going to enjoy the opportunity to give you a big round of applause. So please welcome Cathy McGowan.
So thank you for that warm welcome, and we have a tradition in Indi of acknowledging the traditional owners, so could I just do that for their elders past and present and pay my respects. And I also want to check who might be here tonight from Indi. Oh my word. One. Thank you. I can't see who you are, but it's great to have you here. Then let me check a bit further. Victorians? Any Victorians? A few. Great. Okay, any ex-politicians? Oh, well done. So you're in a prime position. I've prepared a few comments which should take me about 20 minutes, and then we can get into the discussion, which I hope will be the interesting part of the evening. I didn't know my audience, and because I'm a foreigner to Canberra, so I probably haven't hit the mark for all of you, so that's why I'm really keen to get the question bit happening. And I have been to, in my part of the world, we don't have politics in the pub, we have spirituality in the pub. So I've done my fair share of those, so I suspect it's exactly the same thing and it's the same format. So I've prepared my thoughts with that in mind, like controversial topics that we don't have to agree with anybody about, and we can have respectful discussion. So that was my thoughts. So I had 4 things I was going to cover off on. I was going to start a bit with why, bit of my philosophy about all of this, why you do it. Then I want to talk a little bit about being a candidate, some of the story there. I want to talk about the job as I'm experiencing it currently, and talk some reflections on so far. Because today's, I think, is this today the 17th? 16th. Anyhow, it was 10 months ago of the election. So it's just a good time to do that. So I want to start with a short story about that I hope sets a bit of a scene of who I am and why I might bother with this. I'm a farmer, among other things. I'm also a small businesswoman, and I used to be a teacher, and I've done lots of other careers. But I'm really interested in land and growing things, and I'm interested in, well, I'm sixth generation in my community, and so one of the things about being of a long-standing local family is, you know, it takes a really long time for rural communities to grow. You know, getting the landscape organised, getting the roads, getting the tennis clubs, all that sort of community work is done by locals. And you know when you've got a strong community, because things happen, but when you haven't got a strong community, it doesn't happen. So I've always been really conscious in my community of things take a long time, and the local families have been there for a long time, actually know why the tennis court's where it is and why the church is where it is, and there's local knowledge. Okay, so a number of years ago I was paying attention to what makes communities strong, what makes communities work, and that was what I was thinking about. And I went on a holiday to England, and as part of that I went on one of those guided tours where you look at the big garden, the wonderful big gardens in England. Some of you would have done those tours. And I had one of those really big moments and I went, that's what's going on. So I'm just going to tell you a little story about that. So there was a famous English landscape architect in the 1600s called Capability Brown. And he was very popular, and he got most of the big jobs when the English aristocracy, making their money from the New World and robbing the Spanish, coming back from the New World, built all their really big houses. So he got the job of doing the landscape design. So you can imagine those really beautiful big houses being designed and French windows at the front, and they imagined that when you stood at the French windows and opened up, what would the vista you see? And you go back now as a tourist and you see these most glorious vistas, and most of them were designed by Capability Brown. So when we were doing this tour, we learnt about him, and one of the really good commentators explained that he had system in how he did this landscape design. And some of the things that he would talk about was always there would be a hollow in the middle, and he would, if there was not a creek there, he'd construct a dam, a lake, so that the first thing that caught your eye would be water, and then there'd be a little bank, and there'd be a little waterfall, so that there'd be the sound, and little wetlands would follow from it, and there would be formal gardens up the front, and sort of in the middle distance there'd be landscaped slopes, like sheep grazing happily, and on the side there'd be trees, and the trees would be designed in a certain way so that they were very pleasing to the eye. It would sort of be this shape, like this, and then the landscape would come down so the water would catch your eye, then it would go up like that. Can you imagine that? And the house is behind you and you're looking out of it, and it's a very pleasing formal landscape, and it's all designed. And I was just so intrigued by that thought. And the guide told us that he was a good environmentalist, so that these systems were self-sustaining, that the wetlands brought the birds in and did all that sort of really good stuff there, and certain sort of trees brought all the different sort of birds that needed to come, and there'd always be swans and other things happening. So he had it designed so that these big estates were quite self-perpetuating. So that's all interesting. And then the guide said, now he said, look at that over there, look how beautiful that sweep is of those oak trees. And I looked and I actually noticed it when he pointed it out. I hadn't noticed the detail. And I looked at it and I thought, it's just beautiful how it just sweeps up like that. And the guide said, yeah, that was by design. We've got the notes that he left to the gardeners of this particular house. And the notes are, and I'm just going to give you a short part of the story, this could go on for much longer, but the notes are that in 200 years, this is how it should look. But to get it like that, what you have to do is this. So any of those who are gardeners know that in the first instance, you have to plant the trees really close together in the middle, so there's a lot of competition and they grow really tall. So that'll be the height. And then we'll thin them out on the side so they can grow flatter there, and you've got that. So can you imagine that? So the instructions were beautiful graph design, and the instructions were that, okay, we plant, these are not quite the right figures, but 50 trees to the square, whatever it was there, and in 25 years you cut out 1/4, and in 50 years you cut out another quarter, and 100 years you cut out another quarter, so that in 200 years you'll only have 2 trees, where once you had 50. Can you imagine that? So the whole forest, which was planted English oaks, was designed so that it would be like that. that was in itself is interesting, isn't it? But what really grabbed me was here was a garden designer who was giving instructions for 200 years in the absolute belief that the people who were building this house, those aristocracy of England, would still be living there. They could still afford to pay for gardeners and that they would be doing what they were told. Well, and I was there 400 years later and everything that he had designed had come into fruition. And those gardens probably not all owned by the same families, but now people are still enjoying his landscape architecture. Anyhow, that story could go on, and there's lots of other things to talk about there, but I came back to my community in northeast Victoria and I looked around and I thought, well, aren't we pathetic? We know we can't, who has ever thought this way? And I was really critical of being in rural Victoria, and there's no sense at all if we had any idea of planning or doing things for the long term. So I moved from that space of being really critical to appreciating that we'd have an Aboriginal heritage that was 400,000 years old, really. Like, I don't know how old it is, but it's much older than the 40,000 years we claim. And then I started having these conversations with some of my aunts and uncles who are older, and they helped me see that I wasn't quite right, that there was a time in Australians' history when we did have planners. And if I went to my local town of Beechworth, have any of you been to Beechworth? Or you could go to Goulburn or those places and you see the beautiful streets and the beautiful stone buildings. And you dig a little deeper, and in 1864, George Kerford actually got a water system into Beechworth. It's still there now and it's all granite lined, and they never run out of water. So I thought, oh, there's something about those English people, and I'm going to claim that brought this sense to Australia of planning and development and a trust in the future that I think we've lost. So I work as a community developer. That's how I make my living, and I work particularly with women in agriculture. So when I go to women in agriculture in our country towns, I'm saying, you know, who's doing the planning, who's doing the thinking, what's your succession plan for your farm, what's your community development plan? And sadly, there was almost none. So that became part of my work, to start working with communities about visioning the future is what we would talk about. So I just want to park that story there for a sec, because that's my work and that's what I used to do. But in the middle of it, I kept on looking into politics, because clearly the political environment in which you work has a big impact on your landscape and how you work in that community context. So I paid attention to politics, to the Liberal Party, what was their rural policy or what was their long-term vision for Australia. And I have to say I didn't see much there. And I'd go to the Nats and sort of, I'd always be just, all my good friends who are Nats, you know, pushing them, come on you guys, what's your plan for rural redevelopment? You know, what's going to happen out? Let's get some universities into country towns, let's get some public transport happening out here. Not a lot of interest. And Labor was never an option. Like in my part of rural and regional Australia, Labor is just so far behind the 8 ball. Like, it pays attention to city people and it very rarely picks up rural issues. So you listen, but there's not much there for us. And the Greens, in a very similar way, they're not real strong in the country, and I know Christine Milne wants to make the relationship stronger, but it's not there. So when I looked around for a place to play with politics, there wasn't really a natural home for me. So I ended up getting involved in an organisation called Australian Women in Agriculture, and I moved up through the ranks and became national president, and we regularly come to Canberra for lobbying. And in that group of women I found simpatico friends, you know. Oh my God, all around Australia we all looked and we thought community is really important for us, but what's the future for our community? And all of us were volunteer workers in our community, pushing the barrow along. So we would come to Canberra every year for a few days and do our lobbying and try and get changes. And that was all a really good experience, and we got a lot of knowledge and connection into the system. But like, we couldn't really move it, you know, there was not much win there. So then I thought, well, that's good. I like Australian Women in Ag, but it's not really working. I need to get into the farmer organisations. So then for my sins, for 10 years at least, I was a community rep on the Victorian Farmers Federation, and then represented them here in Canberra at the NFF for numbers of years, doing the same sort of work, talking about the future, where we're going to go and how do we get things to happen. So that was all a good life. I was making good money, doing the community work, things were working out. I was very happy actually in that community environment. But then things came to pass about 3 years ago. Some young people whom I love dearly, some of them are nieces and nephews, and others of them are friends who grew up in Wodonga and Wangaratta and Benalla and went off to Melbourne or came here to university. So we've been talking about how do we get young people back, and they just don't want to come in numbers. And when we sat down seriously, come on, you guys, what is it going to take to get you back to live in this fantastic community? And they said, well, Cathy, quite frankly, it would take good public transport. The train between Melbourne and Albury doesn't work, it becomes a bus, it doesn't run, doesn't work, and we haven't got cars. It would take good telecommunications, but they said mobile phones need to work. That in 70% almost of Indi, we have mobile phone black spots. So your mobile phone don't work, and if you're someone under 30, you can't do this on your mobile phone, doesn't work. And we have very poor broadband outside the town. So they said, it's not going to happen. And then they talked about things like jobs would help, Cathy. Good to have a future of jobs, that would be useful. And then that was a bit flippant. But then we would seriously talk about, well, what would it take? And they say, well, Cathy, someone's got to listen to us. And I said, yeah, but what would you say? And they said, well, we would say something about climate change. We would want something happening, if the snow's not falling and this is not happening, and no one ever listens to us on climate change. And then I thought, okay, we'll tick that. And then they'd say, well, we want someone to say something about marriage equality. Not popular in North East Victoria, but we'll tick that, You can imagine the conversations going. So they're not keen to live in a community that's conservative, that no one ever pays any attention to them. So we had that discussion, and then one night, two of the Melbourne people were at a dinner party of all their friends in Melbourne, and it was Saturday night, and they rang me at home and said, Cathy, we've all been having dinner together, and it was May 2012, we think you need to stand to be the member of Indi. And I don't know if you've ever had those calls from the people you love, but I said, that's a really good idea, kids. Talk to someone who cares. That's not going to happen. But in fact, they then did a job on me. They got their friends organised, and they said, we'll work with you, we'll help you, but we think you could do something, and at least you could rattle the cage a little bit. And if you don't do it, who's ever going to do it? And you want something to happen in this community. And 50 years of speeches, 50 years of community work came back into my face, and it was like, well, if not me, who? And can I keep saying no? And what have I got to lose? And I'm old enough and ugly enough, I could give this a run. And then at Christmas time they had another go, and there's a bit of a story there about them. I said, yes, okay, if you guys come on board and help. Now, I'm really happy to pick up the stories of the campaign a little bit more in the middle, because there's a lot more that you'll be interested in about that. But we ran a campaign then with those young people, and the highlights of it were, if I could just pick these notes, the highlights were on election night, which was it the 14th or the 7th? I keep forgetting, it's going to be the 14th, and it became the 7th. So, at the highlights of it, we had 700 volunteers staffing our polling booths. So every single polling booth in Indi had volunteers in our colour, which was orange, at least one, and most places we had much more. We had a really active social media presence. Not only the young people running it, but we had classes in some of these community towns where these young people were teaching other people how to tweet and how to Facebook, because that's how you found out about stuff. And if you weren't connected, you didn't know, so you missed out. So we had classes about that. So we had a really active community education program that ran. We had people committed to values that it would have been really easy in our community for people to bag other people and get into an argument about stuff. So we weren't going to go there. So people had to sign off to this value of respect, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we did all that sort of thing. And then we basically said to people that you can do whatever it is that you know you need to do in your community to get this to happen. Because we know you want this even more than I want it. I'm happy to come second, guys, but if we're going to win, it's going to take all of us to do something. So the power of unleashing in our community, the ability to do whatever it is you need to do within some constraints of respect and engagement was enormous. So we ended up getting, we had choirs, we had young people doing things, we had events, we had a fantastic little story about a group of young people. There was a story in the Weekly Times about how a florist shop in Rutherglen was going through a really hard time because of the election. No one was buying flowers. So these young people all got together with some oldies and some dogs and cats, and they pulled all their money, $200, and they bought every single flower in that shop and took it up to the old people's home as a gift. And they said, this is what communities do that engage, that vote for independence. You know, vote for Cathy McGowan and this will happen. Stop! That's not going to work. But a huge amount of energy was unleashed in the community to do exciting things. Okay, so I'm happy to come back and talk a bit more about that, but I want to briefly talk about now, because I think you might be interested in a little bit about the job of being an independent in Parliament. So when I got the job, it wasn't unexpected. I knew politics and I'm interested in stuff, and I can clearly speak in public, and I'm a good organiser. But what was the job? So I, very early in the piece, had rung Tony Windsor and asked him if he would be a mentor, which he said he would. And there's another local in our community, Tim Fisher, some of you remember him. So Tim's also, he lives in Indi, so he said, good, happy to help you out. And some of the other pollies in the area said, yeah, once you get there, we're not going to vote for you, but we're really happy to help you out if you win. So I had this bevy of people behind who are free with their advice. And Tony Windsor said, Cathy, the most important thing you can ever do in politics is be yourself. Anything else won't work, because you can't keep up the act. And it's really, being an independent, that's who you are. And it took me quite a long time to actually understand that that's probably the best bit of advice I've had, because I can't be anything else, and I'm not going to be anything else, and it's too stressful to try. So being me and being my best self is my job to be as an independent. So I'll come back to that. The second bit of advice I got from Tim Fisher was to dot every I and cross every T and pay attention to every bit of a detail. Because if anything was going to come back and bite me, it would be the letter that I didn't answer properly, or the letter that I didn't read. So work with my staff on that, which I do. The third thing was a bit of advice from my own team, was to remember our values, that we won the campaign by being respectful, by being inclusive, by looking at democracy, by being participatory. So that's your job, don't forget that. And the final thing, a bit of advice, was to remember your roots, really, and to know that I come from the community, I belong in the community, and I work for the community. Don't ever think you're anything else. So coming here tonight and having all you people turn up is a bit of a funny experience, really. But we'll come back to that a bit later on. And I want to talk a little bit about 3 examples of how I'm working in Parliament, because I think that might give you a bit of a sense of how I'm bringing that to the job. So this might take 5 minutes. So first off, when the budget was brought down, you know, we all listened to it, and everyone said to me, well, Cathy, how are you going to vote on the budget? Oh, I don't know, I got no idea when I heard that budget. I thought, how would you vote? I don't even know what the people of Indi would think about that budget. So we had a meeting in our office up there at Parliament House, and we said, well, the answer is to go back and remember what you've got to do, go and ask. So I said, oh, that's a great idea, let's have a consultation about the budget, which we did. And I've bought some copies here tonight. So after that first week, we put the word out. We had a little survey book printed, which we distributed to the volunteers that have been involved in the campaign. We did Facebook, Twitter, let people know. We held listening posts in the main towns. We got volunteers to go and ask people. So it wasn't the most sophisticated process, but in 1 week we got over 750 people give us direct comment on the 3 most important things about the budget. And then volunteers came into the office and they put that into the computers. So what we've got is a report called the Budget Impact Tour, and it reports on everything people said is in here. So it's not analysed. The words are here, and then I got some experts who are really good at summarising to summarise the key points on this left-hand side here. And it was really clear what the main themes were. So then I made my speech in Parliament House based on that. So in summary, it was a fantastic process because people felt heard. I felt able to then speak on their behalf in Parliament. So if there's almost 90,000 people in the electorate, this was almost 1% that got back. So it's a reasonable sample, and we'll do it again next year and the year after, so we'll be much better next time. So in summary, what did people say was that basically it was the job of the government to do the budget, and they wanted the government to be strong on reviewing the budget situation. So fine, and there were some really good things in there that they supported, and they wanted me to support it. They definitely didn't want me to vote against the budget, but there were measures that they didn't like, which you will all know about: the co-payment, the changes to education, the excise on petrol, no, I've forgotten what the other ones are, but there's 5 or 6 main ones that they specifically wanted me to do something about. So then I took this document to the ministers who are responsible for it. So I take it to Christopher Pyne and Health and Employment, the young people's changes. So I took that to them and said, here's what the people of Indi said, and I'll specifically talk about Christopher Pyne here. He said, great, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I'm really pleased you've told me. Thank you very much. And I said, well, it's going to have an impact on us. And he said, yeah, well, come back in a year's time and you have the evidence for it, and I'm really keen to listen to it. So he gave me a really good hearing. We agreed to differ, which is what you could want, isn't it? So I said, fine, thanks, lovely. We keep working with you. And then I took it to the crossbenchers in the Senate. So using all my lobbying powers there to say, well, here's what the people of Indi are saying, can we work together to get this to change? That makes sense? Yeah. So I think we're going to get good change on those 5 or 6 major issues too. So I'll leave, that's what we will continue to do in Indi, so that I'm across it. But the second example I want to talk about is education. So in the budget there are major changes to education and the way it's funded and the way it's going to be run. And my particular interest is agricultural education, because that's what I do. And I looked at it and I went, oh my God, this is just shocking. So, and the community has said of all the things really, the long term in the budget, the changes there are going to have the most impact on us in rural and regional Victoria. We've already got a shocking uptake of post-school education, 17.5% unemployment. We don't have the jobs. Like last Friday, 60 more jobs went from Wangaratta. So it's critical we get good education systems. And privatising it and competing is not going to give us the results we need. So I've been working really actively with my community and with the agriculture sector to say we need to come up with a better plan. Not good enough to say this won't work. So, you know, is there a white paper process, or is there some sort of policy development process that we could put in place over the next 2 years that would give us a better result? But really what was in my head was capability brown. You know, where are we thinking about this country? Where's the plan for the landscape that's called rural and regional, it's called our cities? The lack of leadership and vision. So I've been making speeches about that, and I'm really happy to say that every time I do, the Nats, Labor and Libs get up and they use my own words back at me and say, we've got great leadership. I go, good, you keep telling me that, because I'm going to keep arguing with you about it. Maybe you think you have, but it's not going in the right direction, or maybe we need to argue about the vision. Okay, and the third example I want to give before I finish is my commitment to young people, because they got me here. They won the election for us, basically, and I know fundamentally that if the most important thing I will do is leave a legacy in the electorate for young people, that politics is exciting, it's relevant, it's important, it's easy, come on in kids and young people, because we need you. This is not an optional extra. We absolutely need you. So I'm really pleased, and I've just taken my glasses off so I can't see, but Michael and Angus, Michael and Angus, can you please put your hands up? So they're two young people who happen to be here this week. They're volunteering in my office. They're both 19 and they've come to learn how it is. So every week that Parliament has been sitting since I've been there, we've had volunteers in the Canberra office working side by side with everybody else, picking up stuff, doing work, learning how it works. And we are having such a good time.
Fabulous.
And it's working because they go back and do it, and I build the relationships, and if you do that multiplier effect over 3 years, it's going to have a good impact. And I'm just going to finish on this note, because it's Christmas in July time. So up in Parliament House last night we had some Christmas cake and Rutherglen muscat, and we invited some of the local, if you know Parliament House, it's a corridor, so we had a corridor party really, and invited other people to come and experience it. And lots of the journalists who we've been coming to know came across. So what was her name from SBS? Yeah, so she was there. So she met these two guys, both are really interested in media, and she said, well, come across and have a look. So today she gave them an hour of their time, showing them through the press gallery and how it worked. And Michael's at Swinburne, and he runs a student radio program there, so he did interviews with them to take back. Look, no cost, easy, and one that's going to make a difference. It makes a difference to me, it makes a difference to them. So I'm going to finish just with reflections. So I didn't really know who was coming tonight, so reflection matters a little bit to who you're talking to. But I want to say something to you, if I could. I think you're probably really influential and important people. You know influential and important people. Much more so than I do from a rural and regional part of Australia. So I want to say what we did worked. We had a lot of fun, and it was that Gandhi thing of be the change you want. And I'm here tonight, really. And look, it wasn't hard. I mean, we worked really hard, we paid attention to detail and we got organised, but none of us suffered, it didn't hurt, and it was an enormous amount of fun. And we had such a victory. And now I'm here, and I know I'm making a difference up there. It's not the balance of power, it's not what Clive's doing in the Senate. It's actually changing the culture of the place and how it works. It's building community. It's keeping talking about what's the landscape we're trying to create. What's the 400-year plan? I mean, they go and look at me and go, oh my God. And I just keep doing it because and they look at me and I say, well, Christopher, this is not going to work in the long term. It's going, oh, okay, we'll come back with some evidence, and I'll come back with evidence, and I'll, be persistent on it. So I think my reflection that I want to share with you is like, I'm 60 years old, and I was never going to do anything like this. And what a surprise it's been, and what a powerful surprise it's been, and how easy it's been. Truly. And no one's killed me, I think that was my worst fear, that, you watch what happens in politics and you think, it's going to be horrible. But people haven't been horrible to me, exactly the opposite. They've loved what we've done and they've come along to hear more of it. So I think that's why I bothered to come tonight, because there's lots of other things I could have been doing. But I thought if I have a message, it's do it. If not now, when? And if not you, who else is going to do it?
Well, from the sound of that, it's going to be a crowded ticket on the next ACT electoral ballot. Thank you, Cathy. We'll take some questions. I'm going to throw the first one out. Look, I thank you. I loved your speech, and I love I love both the metaphor and the reality of the 400-year plan and the forests. And I grew up in Newcastle, and I'm always struck. And I was up there yesterday, and even it was winter, it was cold, but I went driving along the beach because I love it. And there are these two spectacular ocean baths in Newcastle, and they're both Art Deco. So guess when they were built? 1930s, the middle of the Depression in Australia, when we were as poor as we've ever been. Right? And what did the people of Newcastle do when they were as poor as they ever were? They built these beautiful baths. And you know how much they cost to get in? They're free. Right? So 70 years ago, when we were broke, we built things that I love to swim in. And for me, they make living in Newcastle. If I moved back there for one reason, it would be to swim in those baths. And here we are today, richest people in the world, one of the richest cities in the richest country in the world, and we're broke. Can't afford it. Can't afford to plan ahead. Where will the money come from? So I guess, I just wanted to reflect that I think it's so important to recognise that people in the past did make long-term plans. And in fact, we will make big long-term plans in Australia. In fact, as you know, we're so far-sighted. We're so interested in the future. We're going to drop $50 billion to build 12 new submarines to replace the 6 we haven't used. No, but get this right, because we might need them in 30 years' time. Do not tell yourself we don't make long-term plans. We do. All right? That's a 30, 40-year plan for submarines. But don't talk about public transport, that's crazy talk. So I guess my question to you is, given that you spoke honestly to the public and they voted for you when you said it, given that you talked to people about the need to make long-term plans and they voted for you and it worked, why do so many politicians think the last thing you'd want to do is talk to the public about long-term plans and investing in the kind of things that we really do want, transport, education, yet at the same time they're willing to drop $50 billion on the subs?
So, my very frank answer, and it's cruel and not nice, is that not enough of us have got involved in the political parties. So the other thing Tony Windsor said to me, and he says regularly, the future belongs to those who turn up. Quite frankly, and if you're not part of the political party, guess what? Someone else is making all the decisions. And you just have to watch it now with all the parties. We're not there. Like, I'm not saying you should be there, but we as a community, if that's the political system we've got, by not turning up, the people who turn up get what they want. And I think there's a whole lot of skill attached to it too. It's not as simple as that. Like in Indi, we've got to do work in helping people understand about what turning up means, what respectful discussions like, what community debates like. Like, you know, we can get into fights pretty easily. How do you actually, it's not an easy thing to engage with young people. How do you do it? So we actually have to learn how to do some of that stuff. So that's your community development and it's your organisational work. And so we often hear about the Labor Party wanting to revitalise itself. But I don't think they've got the people there now who are community developers. They don't. But they're here. You guys who are teachers, I met you before, you know how to do that. You know how to build a community in a classroom. But I don't think those skills are there in lawyers and other people. Now, I'm not being sarcastic about it. I'm just saying we know how to do this, but the people who know how to do it aren't in the places where their skills are needed. So when Anthony Albanese comes here, it would be really nice to have a bit of a conversation with him about how is he thinking about rebuilding the community spirit that was the Labor Party? Not the political spirit, a community spirit that's open for people to feel that they can actually have political debate without being, you know, shot or, you know, made to feel really bad. So I know in our community we found those people and we brought them into the teams and we got them running volunteer training, which we ran everywhere, and we ran them often. So people who basically wanted to volunteer, most of them, about 90%, did the volunteer training, where we talked about this sort of stuff and how do you do it. Because we didn't expect people to know, because, you know, often you don't know. You don't get taught that sort of stuff in the workplace often.
Are you holding to that? Molly, there's a hand up just behind you there.
Thank you for coming on tonight. I grew up in regional New South Wales, essentially virtually the same distance that your electorate is from any capital city as well. I am a member of one of those major parties that fails to connect with young people. I joined to make the change from within, because it's all well and good to throw rocks from the outside, but that's all you're doing, you're not making a change. You speak, demographics tonight notwithstanding, but you speak about connecting with young people who essentially are your base. How can those major parties return to looking after their base, listening to their base, but also connect with young people? Because in 20 years, the people that are voting for them now are not going to be voting for them.
So I could give you I think that's a discussion we've got to have. But I just know in Indo what we did is we told young people that they were important, and then we did what they said I, as an adult, did what they said I needed to do, which was learn Twitter. I just don't think we do it. I think we don't actually do that, listen and then do what we're told, because we think it's too hard or we have all these excuses. So here's a quick story about Twitter. So yes, I know Twitter's really important, and Leah was telling me I needed to tweet. That's good, I did. I learned how to do it, that's fine. And a month into the campaign, she was in Melbourne, she rang me up and she said, "Cathy, you haven't tweeted today." Oh shit, God, I was cross with her. I haven't had time to... So she, you know how you do. She got all the justification of why I didn't have time, and I heard myself. And then I said, "Leah, I just haven't had time to do it." And I could feel Leah, 25, roll her eyes. Like, what sort of time does it take to tweet, Cathy? And then I realised that for me it took a long time. It took me about 3 hours to tweet. You know, to get the words right, to make sure I wasn't making stuff up, to check it, you know, risk management all through my head. So that's what I mean about learning about stuff. This stuff is not self-evident and it's not intuitive. So then I realised that I had to apologise to Leah for, you know, doing. I said, "Well, what could I do, Leah? It's not working for me." She said, "I'll do it for you." Oh no, you know, I couldn't trust you to tweet. You make even more mistakes than me. Right. So that trust was huge. And then I had to go back to our own values of respect. And I said, "Okay, well, Leah, yes, you can have a week's trial." Anyhow, it was the beginning of the end. From there on in, they got a whole tweeting team together. And we did not have one blue the whole time, because those young people wanted the change more than I did. So once I understood that, they were never going to stuff up. And they did. So once I actually appreciated that I had to trust and I had to let go and I had to make the changes. It wasn't about wanting them. And the power was there for them. And then the next bit was when we have our meetings, which we did every Monday night, we were really organised. But sometimes there'd be 20 people at the meeting. And there's one photo that will stay in my memory forever. There was 5 of us adults, some I know, you know, whatever age we were. There was 15 Apple computers, all open, everyone sitting at the desk. They're sitting around on couches like a space like this. So each one of those 15 young people who were managing some part of the campaign were all working on their individual laptops, doing all their stuff there. And they would work, you know, again it was another shock for me because they'd actually work while we were there. They didn't take minutes that it had to be done, they just did it, you know, it all got done. So by the time we'd finished the meeting, all those stuff had been organised. So I think the answer is somehow finding your friends in the system that who are going to work with you, and just help them understand that they're making excuses, that they're the problem.
Because you're constantly being told you're the youth market rather than the base of the future.
Oh, yeah. Well, not even that. You're it. You're a constituent. You vote. So anyhow, that's my sense. Is we've got to make the move and we've got to make the change, and the humility's got to come from this generation that thinks they know stuff and they don't anymore. So good luck. Come and volunteer in the office. And that's what I would do. You go and talk to your local member of parliament and say, oh, let me know, and I'll have. Who? Yeah, but what I'm saying is I could actually talk to them about our volunteer program, and maybe you could come and volunteer up in that members of parliament's office. We could get something like that happening.
You hold them up. Right. Sorry, Molly, there's a question up the back. Thanks, Molly.
Hello. Thank you for your speech. You were talking about your early days involving rural women in decision making. I'm vaguely involved with agricultural sciences, and I was just wondering, because there are so many awful issues facing agriculture and rural people in Australia, what can we do to get young people interested and involved in that and stop the brain drains towards the cities?
Well, boy, come with me and we'll have a bit of a drink afterwards. But I have to say that there's a group of us who are doing a lot of work there. So just today at Parliament House, there's an organisation in Canberra called the Rural Industries Research Development Corporation, RURDEC, and it had 38 young people in Parliament House today called Horizon Scholars, and they give scholarships of up to $5,000 to people not necessarily at university, and they're all up there today talking about it. So I'm very happy to link you into that, because it's really quite a strong movement, and with women in ag, we've got a really good, someone under, you know, your age, and I'm really happy to link you into those guys as well, because they do a lot of work together. But I agree with you, it's like the future for agriculture, we have to do it seriously. Really, like people care about food, we care about food, but if we don't make it happen, and we don't educate people, and we don't do all the other stuff, I'm repeating myself now, I'll stop. We'll catch you for a drink anyhow at the end.
Molly, behind you. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is about what happens now with Voice for Indi. You've got all these people who got involved, who were so inspired about seeing you get into Parliament. I guess what's your vision for the relationship that they have with you in your office in the years between the elections?
Thanks for that question. So, it's a work in progress. So where we are now is that I'm the member of Parliament. I'm no longer Voice for Indi. Voice for Indi has an organising life of its own, and it does stuff, but it hasn't quite worked out what the doing is. But what it did do about a month ago, it had an Indi Shares Day. So anyone who wanted to learn how they run the campaign, and 80 people came up to do details of how that campaign worked. So it does that, and then in September we're going to have another Indi Talks Day, series of days, talking to each other about what we think this vision for the future might be and how we might think about doing that. So mostly people are still keeping in touch with each other. We're lobbying, or they, I should say, are lobbying on things like our train, trying to get movement there. it has a commitment to democratic participation, and so the other thing they're still doing is holding the kitchen table conversations. So I know just in my local community the other day, 15 or so people got together and had a barbecue, and they took this as their topic for the kitchen table conversation, to actually think, well, what do we do about that? What does it mean for our community? Taking it out another step. So it's still going on, but one of the things I think that's happening is we have to reinvent ourselves a bit, because we had this really clear purpose, which was make the seat marginal. Now, we were so proud we did that, but everybody knows it's not enough, but we haven't quite worked out what we do next. So it's a work in progress. But the people still group, they still meet, they still chat. There's a mob of them over in America at the moment doing a participatory democracy thing, talking about Voices for Indi, which is funny, isn't it, in America? So all that sort of stuff goes on. But we've got to really seriously think then about the next election, because what does that all mean? And we talk about it, but we haven't resolved it yet.
Molly, right at the back, if you would.
Would you talk about the transition from values to policy?
Yeah, it's such a good question, isn't it? So here's an honest answer. I go to sleep at night and I say, thanks God that I don't hold the balance of power. I am so grateful I'm not Clive and his mob, and I sit in that little corner of Parliament House with the other four crossbenchers whom we get on really well with. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we ran on a policy base, which wasn't a party political policy base. It was about believing in climate change and market mechanisms. It was about infrastructure. It was about Indi needs infrastructure, like mobile phones, NBN, better train, so that's part of my job. And we need better health and education services, and we need jobs. So my approach to being a member of Indi is not so much a party political approach, it's much more, well, how can I work with the government of the day to deliver for Indi what it needs? Does that make sense? But it's not always like that. I have to do politics up there. So I'm a practical, pragmatic graduate of the NFF style of politics, I think you could say. What do I have to do to get this done, and who do I need to talk to, and what do we need? But luckily I've got nothing that the government wants, so there's no deals that have to take place.
Accept a seat.
Oh yeah, accept a seat. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that. Yeah. So anyhow, I have to say that the campaigning's already begun. There's an Indi for Liberals for Indi office in Wangaratta, and it's got a part-time staffer. And I'm hearing on the grapevine that the focus groups are already happening. And how am I going? So it's going to be. I just love that part of it. You know, it's going to be a really fair dinkum competition, and the best person will win. And if it's not me, that's fine. Someone will have to be better than me. And what a fantastic outcome that would be.
Sorry, can I just ask you a quick question? Just hearing you talk about kind of what the community is doing, there's a state election in Victoria later this year, early next year. Yeah. Is a Voice for Indi kind of thinking about the state election?
So Voice for Indi doesn't have a mind, really, can I say? It's a whole lot of people who do things. So my understanding is there are independents running, and they've asked the mob if they could use that brand name, and everyone said, look, we'd rather you didn't. Don't use, because it's not us. That the Voice for Indi process is geographically specific, Indi specific, relevant to the previous member, related to me, related to our domestic circumstances. So we think it would be, the people said, well, we'd rather you used another name, because we're not going to do it for you. We're concentrating on our community. You need to concentrate on your community, and it needs to be relevant, and the recipe won't work. So run an independent, and we're happy to help you, but no, it's not going to be us. So we haven't got we haven't got a grand plan for changing the world, which I think disappoints a lot of people. But we just go, oh, we're too tired, you know. Let's just do this job. And I have to say, Malcolm Fraser was one of these people. Some of you would know him. So he's also been a great supporter. You know, like, he's one of these wise elders. So he was saying, Cathy, we've got to, Victorian election, we've got to do something. But I was saying, Malcolm, I'm really busy up here. I've got to work out how to vote, And he said, yes, I know it's really hard, but, you could do more than one thing at a time, couldn't you? Oh, you don't understand how this job is taking every single inch of my time. And we could do the national stuff, but then we would lose the local stuff. And what would be the point if I stopped being a representative for Indi? So so I would encourage you to do your own stuff, and you can learn from our experience, but it needs to be, if we're going to do this well, it actually does need to be a bit homegrown.
Yeah, just behind you, Molly.
Cathy, I'm involved in a non-political movement in Australia, which is the movement against coal seam gas and onshore gas. We're used to gas being drilled offshore, and it's way away from our homes, but not our properties. That movement in New South Wales has turned into, I would say, a democracy movement, because it's found that unlike normal mining, which tends to settle in a particular place and provides jobs for the community, even though it may have environmental effects, this one is creeping and divisive. And that movement has become a kitchen table type uniting sort of movement, apolitical. And I'm wondering if you're seeing a role for that sort of thing in your electorate that doesn't end up in a political representation, but a community cohesiveness.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And this whole, just talking about kitchen table conversations, can I just briefly tell you what that was about? So we would have we put together a little kit, not quite as glamorous as this. It had role for a facilitator, 3 questions to discuss, and make it, and then some things about making the space nice, about 12 people, and then when you finished it, send the results into somewhere, which we did. So there's a little kit that people got. So that, again, we did some training, and we had briefing sessions and training sessions. So no one got to do it without some support. So I can remember very early in the piece, we had a briefing session in Wangaratta, and 60 people turned up to run kitchen table conversations. And then they went and did, whatever, with their kitchen, their book clubs or their after school groups or their men's sheds or wherever they were. They got people together and said, we've got these 3 questions, we only need 40 minutes or an hour, and then they would go through it. So it was a very simple process. And as soon as people had finished the formal bit, which was got over and done with pretty quickly, the meetings never finished. I mean, then they started. And people actually got into talking. And we had those values at the front for respect and give everyone a chance. And it's not about being right, it's about being heard. So we had that sort of context to it. So absolutely, people met people they'd never met before, they had conversations they'd never had before. It was, I think for everybody, it was really a liberating experience, and that's what they wanted more of, that chance to talk about what's really important without getting into trouble or someone yelling at you and telling you you're wrong, or which often happens in country towns. I don't think it happens here, does it?
Yep, maybe one last question over here. Oh, sorry, Jeff's got the mic. Probably.
Thanks for your wonderful talk, Cathy. What I'm interested to find out from you is just what your perspective is about the major political parties, in that it seems very clear to me, having been the senior member of the Labor Party, that the Labor Party is loud on the rhetoric in terms of health and education and supporting the community and appealing to working people, but the actual reality is when you unpack their policy practice, they listen to the big end of town to an extraordinary extent, much more than what people actually think. And I saw it in my face, the public-private partnership program in Victoria, which has resulted in a huge drain of money from the budget, and Victoria now spends less in every single area of the public sector than any other state and territory on a per capita recurrent basis. And of course the Australian Institute has certainly highlighted the incredible inequities in the taxation system and in superannuation. And that top 1% are doing incredibly well. But at the same time, the political parties, they foster this illusion that they're out there representing either workers, small business, or farmers. And it would seem to me a possible key to you being successful in the next election would be to sort of try and break that open. Are you thinking about trying to do that? If not, why not?
Well, so I've thought about that a lot, because clearly if I was interested in politics and that whole discussion about joining a party, and it never worked for me, that's why, this harder road of being an independent. One, I think it's a system we've got. Parties belong in Australia. I know that's not what you're asking, but I think they do. The second thing I think about it is not my battle, quite frankly. So one of the things that, as a country woman and in National Farmers Federation and all my politics, in agriculture, you pretty quickly get told to stick to your knitting. There's a huge agenda out there, Cathy, but if you try and bite off all of it, you're treading on someone else's toes who knows more about it than you do, but also about you don't know the detail. So I think constantly I say to myself up there in Parliament House, stick to your knitting, Cathy. I've got my 7 or 10 projects that I've actually got to deliver for Indi on. There's 1,000 things that I could be involved in, and so what I'm saying to my Indi people when they come up with, here's a good idea, can you do something about it? I say, it's a really good idea, I'm going to work with you to do it. Come and use my office, come and volunteer in Canberra, come and have access to any of the skills and any of the skills that I've got to offer you to empower you to do what you think needs to be doing. But I'm actually not able to take on anyone else's agendas, I've got enough of my own. But I absolutely want to do everything I can to say to you, it's important, it needs to be done, your analysis is right, you haven't got it wrong, other people are not going to do it for you. Get your group of friends together, get your vision organised, and think to yourself, if not now, when, and if not me, who, and away you go. So take your own power up on this sort of stuff, because other people are not going to change for us. But the other thing I want to say too is about the political parties. When I listen to the conversation up there, what I don't see is the vision. I actually don't see anyone imagining what 21st century Australia is going to be like. And I'm hungry for it. And what I see happen is Clive comes in, and Clive says, well, I care for people, you know, this is not going to work, bullshit, I don't know what he does, we're going to stop doing that. And I just watched in front of my eyes, again, this power of people who are prepared to do what they think is important. Now, there's a whole lot of opinion about Clive, and I'm not going to go there, but he is one human being who is doing what he thinks needs to be done, and he's brave, and he's courageous, and he's out there.
And he's rich.
And he's rich. But can I say something? It's not his money that lets him do what he does. It is. No, I'm not saying. It's not saying. Of course, it's useful, but I'm up there, and I'm an independent, and there's 3 other people up there as well. So it's agreement between people. What I'm trying to say is, it's easy to say someone's wealthy and they can do it. I'm not wealthy. I can't do it. What I'm really saying is, we can all do whatever we want to do if we want to do it, and money is not a barrier. Absolutely, you think it could be. So here we were in Indi, like, I am not rich in money. And the people who got behind us, we had our first campaign budget of $20,000, you know, and then we had a rate, anyhow, I won't go that story. We got $170,000 in donations once those young people started crowdsourcing and getting on the web and doing their media stuff, money flowed in, because so many other people wanted to be part of what we were doing. So never let money, or someone having money, be an excuse for not wanting doing, because there's money out there that people will give you if you let the young people do your marketing.
We're going to wrap up in a sec, but Cathy, I just want to ask you one last question, which struck me in the question before. I mean, the thing that I found really interesting early on, hearing about the kitchen table stuff, was that that's kind of a direct assault on the thing that I think a lot of people feel very awkward about, and that's talking about politics. You know, we're often trained, Canberra perhaps more so, perhaps less so, it's ambiguous here, because a lot of public servants don't want to talk about politics, you know, lest they get in trouble, lest they get shot. So, you know, when I kind of wake up in the morning and start talking about politics, and, you know, go to bed talking about politics, and perhaps these days you do too. So, can you just kind of, we'll wrap up in a second, but can you just perhaps reflect on how important it was for you to get people actually willing to go and talk to their neighbours and talk to their friends, not about which party do you like the best, or what do you think of, you know, insert candidate's morality, but actually talking about politics and the need for individuals to engage in it, because it strikes me that the kitchen table is absolutely the best place to get people talking about it, but a lot of people think that's actually the worst place. You know, don't talk religion and politics.
Well, if you think Canberra's bad, you try to live in a country town and talk politics. So, there's a really serious question, and we took this really seriously, because if I was going to run, I had to have a platform. You can't just make it up. People had to have a reason to vote for you, that policy question. So the kitchen table conversations with a way of finding out what people wanted us to do. So we were really serious about getting a good process in place. So we knew we had to find a way of talking about it. So what we did was we started with we had this process of briefing everybody, so people learned how to do it, the facilitators learned. And then the actual thing was we started with easy questions like, what's your vision for your community? And everybody can talk about that. So that was the starter. And then what needs to happen to make that happen? So that's an invitation in. The second question was, well, okay, we're talking politics here. What is good representation for you? So then again, that wasn't party political, but everyone has an opinion about what a good representative is. And in our particular community, that was a very popular topic. So that was the second thing. And then the third thing was, well, what are the issues that need delving with? So they became the third thing. So the way we actually put the logic of it, we started with a common ground, and we moved through to the structured what's representation about. And I've got such a mandate out of that second question that what I need to do is really interesting. If I could have 2 minutes on this, it says overwhelmingly people said I need to turn up to community events and I need to represent them. And one of the things that keeps, when I'm up here and people say, well, how are you going to get re-elected? What can you deliver for your community? Like, not once did people in the community say they wanted me to be a cargo cult, bring stuff back. They wanted the seat to be marginal so that would happen, but there was no expectation that I would deliver goodies. And I think it's because we've never had them. We've been a safe Liberal seat forever. But I've got to turn up and I've got to represent and I've got to let the people know what I'm doing. Anyhow, that was a diversion. So the third thing was what people told us was on the issue stuff. And the issue stuff was never political. The issue was the trains, mobile phones, things people wanted in their community. So that's what we did really well. What people did after they'd finished that discussion was then talk politics. Well, how did he get that? Which became the political discussion. And that's when they got into, well, this whole party political stuff. Is the current system working? Do we need to do it differently? Could Cathy do it? Is it worth backing an independent? Well, yes it is, and I will, and I'm going to So at the end of the night, out of a group of 10, we usually had 6 or 7 who were quite prepared to put their hand up to do something because they weren't getting what they wanted, and that process had led them to another place. But I tell you what, the political discussion in the electorate is rich. I don't get away with any people watch how I vote. They let me know. They constantly disagree with me on most things that I vote on because I only won by 300 votes, So there's no sense at all that I don't have to answer to a political public. So we're getting better at the political discussion in that term. But I think the real answer is go back to what matters to people. It's their community, it's their vision. What is it going to take for us to have a good society? How do we get our representatives to think about that? And then, well, what needs to be done to do that? Do you think that makes sense? So we don't start with the really hard stuff. We start with, like it's the teaching, isn't it? You start with the easy stuff that people can nod, and we actually committed that it had to be a good night. It had to have good food. It had to be in a safe, warm place. It had to be the person who was facilitating it, who was not necessarily the host, had to make sure that it was a safe night. So as soon as someone started saying bad things, we've all agreed to be respectful tonight, so let's not go there. And it was we practiced that in the briefings. We do role plays about how you might do some of that stuff. So we weren't naive that it was an easy thing.
So I'll just start to wrap up and say a few words, and then I'll thank Cathy. Last night, I said I was in Newcastle speaking at another Politics in the Pub event. Oh, yeah. Not an Australia Institute one, but one where it turned out I was the first Newcastle Politics in the Pub speaker 16 years ago.
Oh, really?
And this one guy had organised it for the last 16 years.
Wow.
And last night was his last night. And he asked me to come back up. So that apparently I was talking about the GST back in 1998. The GST. But anyway, I was asked a couple of questions about the Australia Institute and recent press coverage of some of the conversations that we've been having with Clive Palmer, and I sort of raise this now because I think it fits in quite nicely with what Cathy's just saying. And we had 2 very polite questions. It was basically, Richard, you know, I've followed the Australian Institute for a long time. What are you doing talking to Clive Palmer? What are you doing? And it's a really important question, so let me just answer it briefly as a way to congratulate Cathy on what we heard tonight. And I said, well, from my point of view, and that's all I can talk about, there's two ways to do politics in a democracy. You can pick a team and you can barrack for it. And everything they do is great, and everything other people do is terrible, or you just shut up a lot when you don't like what anyone's doing. But what we try to do at the Australia Institute is not pick a team, but pick an issue. And once you pick an issue, you go and talk to everyone about it. You know, and sometimes the door doesn't open, and sometimes it opens and you get fobbed off, and sometimes people can't get enough of it. So for me, you know, running a think tank, what do? You do research, you have ideas, you want to change people's minds about things, and you can only change people's minds if you actually go and talk to them. You know, and you know what, Clive Palmer is rich, and you know what, he's actually trying to build a coal mine in Queensland that we at the Australian Institute are trying to stop. But you know what, he didn't really hate renewable energy as much as Tony Abbott did. And I thought talking to him about why it was pushing prices down was a good idea, and I'm really relieved that he thought that was a good idea, and I'm really sad that he wants to repeal the carbon price. But would you not talk to someone for the rest of their term because they voted against something you did want them to vote for? Or do you engage with them? You just keep coming back and talking. So, you know, so I guess my version of politics is all about talking to people. It sounds like you got elected by getting out there and talking to people. And I just think it's wonderful to look out and see such a big crowd of people come to hear you tonight. I think you should.
Thank you. I feel really honoured.
Well, seriously, Cathy, I think it was a wonderful speech, and this is a big crowd. And sure, you might be the member for Indi, but a lot of people around the country clearly love the idea that politicians want to talk to people. So please join me in thanking Cathy.